It's summer. You're enjoying your free time with friends. Don't you all like to have a fresh beer during that time? But the morning after, what happens with all the empty glass bottles? Usually, you bring the rack of empty bottles back to the supermarket. But what happens thereafter? To really understand the route a beer bottle undergoes, you have to know what a supply chain is. First, the producer of the bottle has to figure out what kind of raw materials he needs. In this specific case, the main raw materials will be sand and water. These raw materials will be shipped to the producer. There, the bottles are actually produced, a process that uses a lot of energy. The next step is the beer producer, who will fill the bottles with delicious beer. Once the bottles are filled with your favorite beer, they are sent right to the supermarket. Let's note that sometimes an additional stage can be added to the supply chain. A distributor might fulfill the task of delivery to the supermarkets. And finally, you and your friends will get the beer at the supermarket. Okay, now this looks simple. But what happens if there are multiple suppliers, multiple producers, multiple distributors, and even multiple supermarkets? A real mess, huh? One important issue for the actors in the supply chain is the existence of uncertainty. Let's take a much closer look at the different stages your beer bottle undergoes and the uncertainty each stage introduces. The first stage, the supplier, already holds in a huge amount of uncertainty. In a perfect world, one could always make sure that there's enough sand and that it arrives on time. But the real world looks different. Disruptions of raw material might occur. In the next two stages, the bottle manufacturing and the bottle filling, both plants have to face numerous incertitudes. One main risk are, for instance, machine breakdowns. And you, the beer consumer, introduce the biggest question mark. It is all about variability of the demand. Cold autumn weather and winter weather makes you feel like staying at home, drinking a hot chocolate, and sure forget about a fresh beer. This leads to a decrease of the demand for glass bottles. However, in spring and summer, you love to sit down with friends and have one beer, 2 beers, or even more. Hence, the quantity of beer you and your friends ask for increases, which means more glass bottles are needed. As you can imagine, an efficient supply chain has to adapt to such shifts in demand. Finally, one main uncertainty remains: time. The transfer between the different stages, transport of raw materials, transport of empty bottles, or transport of filled beer bottles, introduces a risk of lateness. There are many reasons for delays, but traffic jams and adverse weather are the most common ones. All these different factors that introduce uncertainty to a supply chain might seem small when considered separately. But in reality, the supply chain has to be considered as a whole, and this means all the different uncertainties add up. But what happens once you have taken back your empty beer bottles to the supermarket? Actually, you're accomplishing the first step to closing the supply chain. Closed-loop supply chains are a key concept in modern supply chain management. Basically, closing the loop means to implement a reverse movement into a supply chain. But then again, this additional route for your beer bottle introduces uncertainty. What type of uncertainties? First of all, one can never know how many bottles will be returned to the recycling plant. Some of your friends might be too lazy to return the bottles, for instance. Besides, the timing of the bottle return cannot be predicted with certainty. It might take 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 months, or sometimes even a year. And another issue is the unpredictable condition of the returned bottles. They might be dirty or even broken. But if closing the supply chain and hence recycling adds even more uncertainty, is it worth implementing a closed-loop supply chain? In the case of a beer bottle, yes. First, regarding the financials. Well, manufacturing a new bottle out of sand necessitates a huge amount of energy. Then cleaning the returned bottles requires a lot of energy too. But in the end, still less than the production of a brand new bottle. And nowadays everybody knows that energy costs a lot. On an environmental level, using the same bottle multiple times reduces the amount of resources we take from our planet. And we know resources are limited and should be used in a responsible manner. Finally, a good image is key for a company's success. Nowadays, consumers' purchasing behavior is highly influenced by green initiatives taken by the organizations. And clearly, using recycled bottles enhances the image of a company. So now you know that a good and robust supply chain needs to take into account a lot of unpredictable factors. Not an easy task. We have realized that designing a supply chain requires qualified management. However, recent events remind us that some factors destroy any well-planned supply chain. Earthquakes cause chaos. Volcanoes cause the world to stop. And tsunamis showed how quickly anything can be destroyed.
Reduce, reuse, recycle. Reduce, reuse, recycle. Reduce, reuse, recycle.